The modern world is impossible to imagine without a car. Despite the fact that the car is basically just a pile of iron and a set of spare parts, no one treats it like that. Many people believe that a car has a soul, and for someone, it is a full-fledged family member. And some people take care of their car much better than they take care of themselves or their relatives and friends. And quite often, we only need to look at the car to fully understand everything about the person. You don't even need to talk to him, everything is clear enough. And of course, there are right and wrong cars. If you drive a Renault Logan, then it is unlikely that you will be missed on the road in the same way as the owner of a Hyundai. Although the old leaky Gelic will cost the same as the new Logan, but it will be missed much more often than you. But can it be that the car will become a real problem for its owner? Not this story here, that my DSG has fallen off for the second time in a week, but can, for example, the owner be beaten for having the wrong brand of car? And can a person be killed at all for choosing the wrong car? It sounds absolutely wild. If you come to the assembly of the Peugeot Club now and start yelling there that Peugeot is a piece of shit, then the maximum that you will get is you will be pelted with cosmetics. Believe me, I know what I'm talking about. But the problem is that such moments really existed in history. And today, from this video, you will learn how and why the cult of cars was born, how automakers shot their workers, and they destroyed their production in retaliation. How did the trip of one Ford factory worker, here to us in the USSR, change the whole course of automotive history? And what people are willing to do when an empire built on cars collapses. Ahead of you is a thorough, detailed, and eventful history of Detroit, the most important city in the automotive industry. Enjoy watching. Naturally, when Detroit was originally created, there was no talk of an automobile empire or anything else at all. In general, it was in principle. It was originally Canadian in general. It was a trading settlement, just a piece of land surrounded by a fence, which was intended to trade furs there with the Indians. Furs are such fur braids on the handlebars, but the Indians can't ride without them in any way at all. Every Indian must have one. Until the 19th century, there were just thousands of people of the white population hanging out there, as if the black population, slaves, Indians, were not considered people at all, so all the data is available only for the white population, and up to 1,000 people have always lived there. That is, for those times, it is in principle a fairly large settlement, but one way or another a settlement, just a fucking camp with a fence. At some point, this village burns down to hell in 1805 year, and capital construction of the territory begins. Shipyards and the first production facilities are being built, and this is how Detroit looked 100 years later, in 1905. But you and I have been interested in this city since the 5th of August, 1899. On this day, the DC Detroit Automobile Company is founded. It is the first U.S. automobile company in Detroit. It was founded by Henry Ford, who is already familiar to us. Suddenly, Ford wasn't the first company, Henry. He gathered 12 investors, and in fact, this is the first car company that Ford has acquired. If you remember that famous legend, where Ford assembled some kind of cart with some kind of engine in his shed, then this just preceded the opening of this company. Ford seemed to have ideas, but there was no money. He was an ordinary mechanic after all. And so he came with this cart, in fact, and convinced 12 investors, among whom was the mayor of the city, to invest $86,000 in it. In fact, it's $2 and $6 million for modern money. In principle, a very decent amount. The product of DC's activity was such a pepperlack for deliverers. It was heavy, slow, inconvenient, very difficult to assemble, and well, as if the idea was stillborn in principle right away. Therefore, a total of 12 pieces were released. All the money was spent, and Ford, with a very satisfied look, dumped the company, and founded his own Ford company in 1903. And a year later, in 1904, he founded the Ford Peak plant, which became the first full-fledged automobile plant in Detroit. And so Ford is the first element in our scheme. This is the first foundation stone, the foundation of the future of Detroit. The next moment, 1904, a certain William Cropper Durant buys out a huge chunk of Buick shares. At that time, Buick already exists. It is already in principle a successful brand. It is not yet in Detroit, but it is in principle a successful car company already at that time. Durant is a much less well-known character than Henry Ford, although in a few years, he will create a brand that you've definitely heard of. Such a small, inconspicuous General Motors company. Durant is not an inventor, but an entrepreneur of pure water. Since childhood, he tried to sell everything that came to hand: cigarettes, newspapers, shoes. Then it all came to real estate, and there, through the stages of his growing up, he came to the fact that in 1886, he already had his own factory for the production of chassis for horse-drawn wagons. He made cart wheels, in short. And his way of thinking actually predetermined the whole path of development of General Motors, including the automotive industry. Because maybe I will reveal something not obvious to some of you, but GM has never produced cars. GM is just a management company. And the manufacturer is always there, like Chevrolet, Opel, GMC, Cadillac. There was the same Buick. And GM is simple. It's just an office with managers and managers. When Durant started driving the Buick, the company was doing frankly shitty, but they were just producing something in some volumes, and were in principle, well, pretty inconspicuous. But in 4 years, Durant has taken the Buick to the lead. And in 1908, the Buick was the best-selling car brand. Ford Model T, however, also appeared in 1908 year, but somehow he did not have time to noticeably move the competitor. The fundamental difference in the business models of Durant and Ford is that Ford put all his chips on one model, and Durant put on the fact that the manufacturer had a wide range, so that there was a wide range, and so that for each consumer could find something suitable for himself. In the 1990s, this was a rather non-obvious thing. And in fact, they both turned out to be right in their own way. Ford's legacy is in the conveyor method of car production, and in fact, how all manufacturers assemble their cars. And Durant's legacy is in the business model. And most modern companies and dealers work according to the schemes that Durant once came up with. So for the automotive industry, he is no less a significant character than Ford. So, in 1908, when the Buick is on the horse, Durant creates a General Motors management company, completely transfers all the shares and all the management of this company, attracts a bunch of investors, and starts buying up everything that moves and everything that lies on the road. Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Oakland, aka Pontiac in a modern way, Rapid Motor Echo, aka James Truck in a modern way. In addition to automakers, GM is starting to buy up all manufacturers of components and everything that is somehow tied to the automotive industry. They even almost bought a Ford at one time, this one in 1989 year, but this deal was not approved by investors. And because they thought it would be risky if they were straight monopolists in everything, there might be problems with the government and tralala. And we decided that, okay, let Ford live for himself and collect his cars there. But all this policy did not bring huge profits because GM still lost to Ford in sales. Shareholders and investors wanted to receive their dividends for the invested bobos, but Durant spent absolutely all the profits on buying more and more new companies, so shareholders, in fact, and investors sat and sucked pesos. At some point, they all got together, thought about it, and just bought out all of Durant's shares, and threw him out of the company in 1910. But Durant was not upset. He took the mustachioed racer Louis Chevrolet to found, oh my God, what a surprise, Chevrolet. And in fact, here in this company, they already decide to focus on the budget segment, on inexpensive and high-quality cars, in order to move the Ford Model T position a little, and they succeed. Chevrolet starts to develop very quickly, squeezes out a part of the market, and Durant again seems to be on a horse. And being a very skillful schemer, he begins to change Chevrolet shares for GM shares. Here he sold, here he bought, back and forth, Opel. And here he is again on the board of GM. Plus, he borrows more money from investors, buys everything left in the GM in general. And with all the money that the company actually has, he begins to systematically buy everything that is not nailed down again. But in the 1920th year, the demand for a car is falling very much, and if you conduct such an expansion as as a Valorant. It threatens simply the death of the company, because suddenly you have huge financial holes, one absorbs the other and that's it. Hello, we've arrived. Investors gathered once again, thought again, counted everything once again, and decided that they also did not need Durant again, and at that moment they were throwing him out of the company forever. But as you can guess, Gem still exists, and it becomes a second stone or concrete slab, whatever you like, in the foundation of the future of Detroit. And it also appears here on the diagram. All successful people of that time were united by curiosity and a thirst for new knowledge. Of course, 100 years ago, the world was radically different. Ford, Durant, and other actors in the story, at least, did not have the internet, which was an additional obstacle to new knowledge. In order to learn something, you had to talk to people live, communicate with your mouth, arrange time, meetings, then come to tell people something live. But today, thanks to the internet, everything has become much easier. It is enough just to have the desire to study together with the online Skillbox University. Yes, this is again a divine lead-up to integration. In November, the Skillbox Online University hosts an online conference on 3 popular digital professions at once: web design, internet marketing, and programming. Experts from popular fields will tell, and most importantly, show by the example of specific cases, how to work in a particular profession. If you are just going to enter a university, or you already have a diploma, but you are still not sure about the direction of your future activities, the online conference will be able to help you. And participation is still completely free. The Online University of Skillbox is the leader in the online education market in Russia, according to Riot. In the 2019 year, more than 30,000 students have trusted Skillbox. All the necessary links are in the description, and hurry up. There are only 1,500 free tickets, so come on, go ahead for new knowledge. While the Chevrolet Durants were picking their production in garages there, in 1911, a certain Walter Percy, with a very talking name, Chrysler, came to the Buick. He comes to work as a manager for the production of Buick cars. Chrysler, by the way, was an unrealistically cool dude. He was very well versed in technology, loved production very much, and thanks to his talents, he was a really talented person. By the age of 30, he held the post of General Manager of America at Locomotive Co., the largest iron building railway company at that time in the USA. And there is a very beautiful legend that Chrysler worked there all his life, from the position of a cleaner, made his way to the top of the board of railway companies, and this is really true. That is, he really came to the base position, but he could never afford a car. He always dreamed of it. And so, as soon as he took the post of general manager, he was able to buy a car for himself. So, I admired its design. I mean, I disassembled it in the garage, put it back together. I didn't know how to drive it yet, and I decided that everything from now on, my life will be connected only with cars. I'm running to do them. Oh, that's it. Bye. In fact, everything was much less prosaic. In the certificate, there was such an investment banker, James J. Storrell. He noticed a young manager who was moving up the corporate ladder very quickly in the American Railroad Corporation and was like, guys, or maybe it's, well, with a dude's hunt like that. Well, like a normal guy. And in fact, they, along with Buick president Charles Nash, came to Chrysler and were like, bro, let's work with us. We won't pay you money normally, but it's very interesting here. We'll give you the entire production line. You'll set it up, and then we'll see. And the most amazing thing is that, well, Chrysler agreed. It's real. From him, he was given a meager salary at all, like $6,000 a year. For his, well, position at that time, it's like, rap. What? Like a dude left for a spear. But apparently, somehow the guys gave him such a very colorful picture of what processes he could influence that he agreed with great Joe. In short, he was stupidly cheated, and maybe there was a place to be, that he admired some kind of car there, disassembled, assembled, but in fact, he was just stupidly cheated. Anyway, Chrysler showed itself in all its glory. In 4 years, he reorganized the production line in such a way that production increased from 20 cars per day to 550. Make sense of it in 1920, try it. By this time, Durant had returned to the board and offered, well, he saw a talented manager and offered him just a vice president, to which, of course, Chrysler agreed, but he held this position for only 4 years. Over the 4 years of working together with Durant, they had a lot of disagreements because, after all, the guys had radically different approaches to doing business. And in 1920th year, it was because of disagreements with Durant that Chrysler leaves to guess what? To found a Chrysler. This dude's, of course, is the naming of this original. Yes, fuck, no one has ever guessed before you to make such a company, call it by name. In general, it's awesome, but it wasn't that simple. It was already the 20s, the time of self-taught garage had already passed, and it would not have been possible to just go and start a car company from scratch. Resources, capacities, production, money and blah 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 were already needed. Ford was already working hard. The Gem car was already working hard. That is, well, like the market was already competitive and busy. And in fact, it is not entirely clear whether Chrysler left with the idea of creating his own company. Or was he just leaving Gem? Because right after Gem, he got a job back on the staff, but in Willis Overland. More precisely, he did not go there himself, but the Willis board. He was called there to sort out their hemorrhoids. There the company was on its knees, everything was bad. The guys invested a lot of money there, they didn't get a damn thing, and they actually called Chrysler to sort out this situation for them somehow. By the way, he was offered $1 million salary per year. It's still a lot of money, if anything, just for a second, and in the 1920s it's generally like, well, everything. The ceiling, the finish, well, you won't have enough to spend it all for a lifetime. That's it, stop. And this is per year. And he was signed a contract for 2 years. That is, like Chrysler was earning just fine. And by the way, he left Gem already with his personal account of about $10 million. Let me remind you again that initially the dude came to the position of manager with a salary of $6,000 a year. So, just in case, so that you understand that Chrysler in principle was able to earn money like that normally. Chrysler honestly plowed 2 years in Willis, and his gaze fell on the Maxwell Motors company, which was already bending in the same way by this time. What amused me very much was that Maxwell. This is a company this is the very first company in the history of the automotive industry that decided to position its cars for women. In 1920, they were not considered people at that time. That is, there are guys there. Their people were still conferring like women. These are people, whether they should be given the right to vote or let them wash the dishes. And here, Maxwell is like, we're going to make cars for them. Like, it's not clear if this person is at all or not. And they're like, well, it's fine, it'll roll. They sponsored Alice Ramsey in 1909, who drove Max's car to the States from coast to coast. There was an impossible amount of hype. All the media wrote, the whole thing was discussed. A troll, that's how it is, a female motorist, that's all. But there wasn't much sales, and the guys kind of missed the moment that, well, maybe a woman and a man. Maybe. But they didn't have any money. The men have all the money, and the men in the mouth staggered to buy women's cars, and Maxwell had no sales. In short, Chrysler came and decided that fuck women, I would make cars for normal guys. The problem was that Maxwell was a pretty big company, and just like that to come and throw everything the fuck away. It didn't work out to redo everything. Therefore, it took Chrysler 3 years to reorganize. And 3 years later, Maxwell Company officially ceased to exist, and Chrysler was born on the capacities of this company. They started very cheerfully, almost immediately launched 2 additional brands, Pontiac and up to the Honeycomb. And then they bought out another company with an impossibly creative name, I'm in Dodge Company. More precisely, he bought out the Chrysler Company, not to remove it from Dodge, but from their family, because, in the 19th century, pneumonia was suddenly a fatal disease. They kind of suddenly really died together. No offense, nothing, just pneumonia. And now it's like you ate pills, and everything is fine. And then welcome to Earth. The main thing is not to tell it to the anti-strangers. In general, everything was fine with Chrysler. In 1928, he was even named an American. There, like a person of the year. And remember, you have to remember, I believe that you watched this Spider-Man cartoon. Well, this is a cartoon from Spider's childhood. Remember, there was such a dude, a villain, a task, I think her name was, such a healthy square person. And he lived here in a huge skyscraper. So this is the Chrysler building. This building was built by Chrysler. And now you're thinking how rich a dude he was. It is still, 100 years later, one of the most important and iconic buildings in America. It's like you don't take off the lamp and Instagram photos that you are a successful success. This is a huge skyscraper to build, just from nothing to do in fact, because he didn't really need it. Let's fuck a huge machine here, let it be. Anyway, Chrysler Corporation and Walter Peach Chrysler. This is the third stone in the foundation of the future of Detroit. Thus, we are approaching the 30s. All the top brands Ford, GM, and Chrysler are located in Detroit. Their production facilities are located there. They are shaken to the full. Money, miracles from all sides. Just imagine, the most successful industry in the world at that time was automotive. All the top manufacturers are concentrated in one place, and in addition to the automakers themselves, all the enterprises that supply something in one way or another are also concentrated there, such as paints, oil, wheels, and everything in a row. Now we need to move away from the cars a little bit, so that we have a complete picture. I need to give you a little context about the city itself. And what the fuck, did I just spend 3 weeks in English sources? Or rather, me. I'll tell you everything name. The city has become the fourth city by population in 20 years, and since it was purely industrial, not Nobel Prize laureates flocked to it, but in fact, a handyman, mostly black. Adhere Ford's policy that he paid his workers much higher than the market and promised to pay everyone much higher than the markets. Most importantly, I really paid. The salaries of workers at the Ford plant were the highest in the market. Detroit instantly became the center of the Great Migration. The Great Migration. This is a process in the USA. There in the 20s and 30s, when the entire rural South was dumped on the industrial North. Firstly, because the Southern hot cowboys did not consider Negroes as people at all, and shot at them without hesitation. Secondly, it is better to work in a factory in the North and earn money than to sit in a field in the South and earn a bullet in the ass. What does this nigga allow himself? Okay, calm down. Plus, white people who had their own black workers, servants, tralala, similarly dumped to the North, because there is a growth prospect, and of course, they took their entire camp with them. It's going to be a little difficult now, but hold on, and try to keep the whole picture in mind. The city is populated mainly, overwhelmingly by handymen, mostly blacks, immigrants from other countries, Jews. Hi, Ford. And the top management, white people, who, in fact, earn money from all these people. Some do not respect others very much, and therefore, in 1920, a wonderful branch with such a charitable organization called the Ku Klux Klan opens in Detroit. The Ku Klux Klan originally appeared in the South. Then, together with the Great Migration, it spread to the whole country. The main idea of this organization is in no case to prevent equality between whites and blacks, and to save the country from the invasion of Negroes. The result of their activities were hundreds of thousands of human victims. The main scope of their terror took place in the first half of the 20th century. During the peak period, in the 20s, the number of the Brotherhood reached 6 million people. And even now, in the 21st century, KKK still exists. We go further, and we throw a dry law on this whole bunch, which was in effect from 1920 to 1933. And here, we need to say a little about the location of Detroit, because it was, well, now it is on the border with Canada. There is the Strait of Detroit, and naturally, it was the main center and hub of alcohol smuggling at that time, during the Prohibition. And who is involved in alcohol smuggling? That's right, very peaceful. Uncles with Thompson submachine guns. By the way, maybe one of you has played a game called Gangsters 2. It's very ancient. There's blood flowing from your eyes when you look at the graphics. But it's one of my favorite games there in general in my childhood. And this is the game just about this time. If someone has not played and is ready to suffer a little on the schedule, and here I advise straight, putting the whole thing together. Imagine the growing production, the flow of Negroes into the city, who are met at the border of the city by peace-loving guys in white caps. Bootleggers with machine guns are constantly driving around the city, and all this time, we still have the top of the top management sitting on top of us, who is fattening and throwing money around like this, because they really have money with their ass. And so, putting all this together, we get a very friendly atmosphere of a large developing industrial city. And the cherry on the cake will be the stock market crash of 1929, when quite a large number of smart and not so smart people went out for a walk out the window. Only according to official statistics, only according to official data, about 3 or 4 people a day were self-sawing in Detroit. This, if anything, is quite a lot. That is, the average resident of the city at that time. This is a black handyman who goes to hide in the doorways, just so that his dude in a white hat does not catch him. Drunken gangsters with machine guns constantly cross his path. People fall from above, crash. And that's actually how you go to work for yourself. Production declined very much during the Great Depression, which is logical. Factories, of course, had to fire people in batches because there is nothing to pay wages with and there is not much to produce. There is no demand. And the result of all this was the Hunger March on the 7th of March, 1932, which was called in the press the bloodiest day of the automotive industry. Mostly employees of the Ford plant participated. And then, of course, you can go into the fact that the Communist Party has always supported the unrest among the workers there. There were agitators there all the time. The guys believed them that an equal world was possible, that's all. But I don't get into politics. I'm kind of interested only in what happens to cars. And even if we had brought politics here, we wouldn't have parted here until Sunday. Although it's Monday, there were also headlines in the press about Ford Massacre, which translates as the Ford Massacre. The Ford Massacre. So, 5,000 people gathered, wrote 14 demands among the standard ones there, like to hire everyone back, raise everyone's salaries, remove racial discrimination, peace, friendship, cookies, that's all. But what is interesting to us here is that for the first time on this day, there was a demand to give workers the right to organize trade unions. This is very important, why you will understand further. But in 1932, instead of fulfilling their demands, workers received bullets in response. If you read the original newspaper articles of those times, and I really did this in preparation for the video, then it describes an exceptionally peaceful demonstration that first went through the city, then decided to go towards the factory. And so, when they approached the fence of the Ford plant, they were met by the police. The guards first fired tear gas, then batons were used, then someone fired into the air, then at people. As a result, 60 workers and 25 policemen were injured, and 5 workers died after this march within 3 months. Believe the press or not? Question. Because, well, on the one hand, yes, to shoot at a peaceful demonstration. This, of course, is horror and nightmares, and this is by no means unacceptable. On the other hand, I personally somehow don't really believe that 5,000 laid-off workers, hungry, who stood in the cold all day, went to the Ford plant just to drink tea. I doubt it very much. And yet the plant, this is private inviolable property, that's all. In America, this is very strict. That is, if you even now climb into a private territory, you can be shot, that's right, seriously, with a gun. And no one will even say a word. And then the mores were even tougher, so in principle, the police and security, most likely, just performed their function at that time. But the fact that this is really a bloody day of the automotive industry there, of course, I do not argue with this. In defense of Ford, I can also say the following, that at that time, he really had the highest salaries in the entire industry. At the time of 1929, it was something like $1,600 a month. $1,600. It's still like normal money. You can get blown up. And then, several families could exist on this money at all. It was enough for one person to work there, to keep a whole camp there at all. And yes, of course, salaries fell at the time of the Great Depression, but they still amounted to $750–800, which was also good money. Anyway, the most important thing for us here is to record that the demand about trade unions was made for the first time. They will still play their part, but for now we will return to the city. After any, even the most pitch-black economic ass, a very rapid rise begins. And in 1935, when the economy was allowed, Detroit just starts to break away into space. People are starting to break into the city, just at an unimaginable speed. Here's a little bit of official statistics, official figures that it doesn't even make sense to comment on. In the context of the 1930th to 1950th, the city added 300,000 people. And this is the time when there were no computers, there was no normal documentation, and this is only official data. I think the real scope of events was much larger. And besides the expected economic growth, there is an explanation for this new round of migration. An event begins where Americans will eventually be able to earn fabulous money, and Detroit will become the world's center of production and industry. The Second World War. We all know that in the war, our famous mustachioed dude, the British famous fat dude, and the American horseradish understand who in general became the winners. And the thrill of America was that there was no military action on its territory. The whole movement took place here, in Europe, and among the Japanese, well, for the most part. And the Americans simply produced military equipment, supplied their army, supplied their allies, produced everything they needed, and earned incredible money from this whole enterprise. Civilian cars in the United States at that time were practically not produced. All production worked for the military machine. We all know the exploits of our grandfathers and grandmothers. We know how mobilized the USSR was. Absolutely all factories and enterprises produced everything necessary for the front. The whole country plowed weapons, equipment, ammunition. And now look at the numbers. This is the volume of GDP in billions of dollars during the war. And I am showing this here not in order to somehow downplay the feat of our ancestors and the role of the USSR in the war, but so that you simply understand the scope of the US military machine at that time. Look at the 42nd, 43rd, 44th, 45th years. To what extent the United States produced more military equipment than we did. And the center of all this, of course, was Detroit. For example, during the war, the Villa Urine plant was built in an absolutely impossible time, where B-24 bombers were produced. It was 45 kilometers from Detroit, owned by Ford. 42,000 jobs, 3,500 hectares in area, and an assembly line 1.5 kilometers long. And since Ford understood a little bit about assembly line assembly, a bomber came off the assembly line of this plant every hour. A 25-ton, bitch, bomber was assembled completely from a set of bolts and nuts to a whole bomber in 60 minutes. Chrysler also did not break off and collected tanks and self-propelled guns and stuff like that, and worked for the Detroit Arsenal. If anyone is interested, Google it. But here's just a fact, for the entire period of the war, Chrysler has collected 90,000 combat units, tanks and self-propelled guns. Let's not do this. The entire Soviet Union, for the entire duration of the war, including tanks and self-propelled vehicles, everything, created 95,500 units. And there's only a Chrysler 90. I think it won't be so easy to understand. They were not bombed, they had nothing. They just produced military equipment, earned money on it, and that's it. And after the war, they still emerged victorious, and they got war reparations, territories, factories, equipment, everything that could be withdrawn from the countries, well, losers, so everything could be safely taken to the States. In short, the dough was just an ass chew. And this is exactly the reason for what we call the golden age of the automotive industry. The 50s. When I hear the phrase American car, it's not this modern shit that appears in my head, the cars of the 50s and 60s. The children of Detroit. Buick Roadster, Cadillac 62nd Series, starting with the 4th generation, absolutely crazy Chrysler Town and Country, Chevrolet Belle, Chevrolet Impala, Chevrolet Del Rios, Cadillac DeVille, Ford de Rio. First generation series, just look at him. Just look at what he's like. Ford Thunderbird, and of course, Ford Mustang, Dodge Charger, Chevrolet Camaro, and so on. There were just an unimaginable number of such cars. Gasoline froze like water. Everything that was less than a 5-liter 8 for the engine, in principle, did not count. And the cars of those times had a 3-year production cycle. Now every model, every big manufacturer, has a 7-year production cycle. That is, you have a car coming out. In 3 or 4 years, it has a restyling, then a new model, and then it was 3 years old. And this was a standard that could not be broken at all. You wouldn't have had time just for competitors if you had been producing cars for so long. People were so madly sweeping away everything that the Cadillac of the 62nd series changed every year. Every year, either changed. Either the appearance or the engine changed, or both at once. And now, here in October, I am now relevant again. Here is this meme that all suckers go with last year's iPhones, with a gadget for $600,000. And then it was like that with cars. If you had last year's Cadillac 62nd series, that's it, you're a sucker. Go for a walk. With cars for tens of thousands of dollars, not with some fucking phone. Chrysler, for example, had an advertising campaign in which they proudly declared that our cars are the most uneconomical cars in the world. And they were wanted because of this. They ate gasoline like they weren't in themselves, and people wanted such a car for themselves because it was super prestigious. The modern brain does not understand this at all. What it feels like 40 liters. I take it. Fire. Mine fits. 35. Here you are a sucker. Then here I have a rocket eats. Well done. What? It is at this moment that the cult of the car is born. It is at this moment that the image that we all dream about is born. This is a highway that goes over the horizon. You're driving a 6-meter coupe, which has 8 under the hood, and you're kind of sawing into the distance somewhere. That's when this cult was born. And if you and I have this, well, some kind of pipe dream, then everyone lived like this. They all had it. They had 6-meter coupes, huge, impossible motors, and these highways like going into the horizon. It was at that moment in the 40s and 50s that absolutely all highways were laid across all states. They wrote songs about cars. For example, Dinah Shore sings about the fact that you urgently need to go on a trip in your Chevrolet.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. The Rockies way out west are calling you.
Oh, it's a honey. Get in the know. This new Chevy has go, 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 go.
Life is completer in a Chevy.
Life firm and Chevy. You corners.
Yes, of course.
I simply didn't sit in a modern cruise. At the same time, automobile clubs begin to multiply massively. And so, if Ford Model T made it possible to have a car, then American cars of the 50s gave people the opportunity to fall in love with them. They talked about cars, dreamed about them. The whole way of life was built around them. In the 45th year, Americans owned 25 million cars. In the 55th year, there were already 52 million of them. The fleet has actually doubled in 10 years. And cars were, well, straight drugs for people at that moment. And Detroit was their dealer, who constantly supplied them with new doses. But, while the top management of Ford, GM, and Chrysler reveled in their success, and reacted as best they could, the situation began to change a little. In fact, all this splendor in general and Detroit in particular was finished off by a rather large coincidence of factors that did not depend on each other. As it always happens, all the young people who were born there, like in the 50s or there in the late 40s, and grew up during this madness, at the age of 17 or 20, began to propagandize diametrically opposite values. One of the most popular cultures in the modern world was born. Hippies. They all wanted to achieve enlightenment, nirvana, there through meditation, marijuana, alcohol, gatherings with a guitar around a campfire, and so on down the list. And as you can guess, there is not a word about U8 in the list of these values. Plus, hippies believed that the best accommodation option was communities. Like there is a common territory, everything is common, no one owns anything to anyone, everyone shares with each other, tralala. And in this concept, it was quite strange to own your own car in the same way. Therefore, none of them dreamed of their own brand new Cadillac. What did the leadership of the Big Three do about it? That's right, they scored a dick. They say that now these students will get stoned there, get drunk, get laid, then turn on their brains, find a normal job, and finally buy our brand new product. Our new guy is 8, and everything will be great. You don't have to worry. Waiter, bring the champagne. And in 1956, when they are still fattening, sales are growing, everything is high. A point of no return happens. Without a declaration of war and warnings, the Packard factory is closed. Not Hewlett-Packard with printers, but Packard, a car manufacturer. I didn't specifically mention this manufacturer at the beginning of the video, in order to leave it for dessert for those who haven't fallen asleep yet and have endured up to this point. Packard. This is an American Rolls-Royce. The company was founded in 1899th year, and, well, in fact, it was, in short, an American Rolls-Royce. And guess what was the dude's last name? Who founded it? That's right, Packard. His name was Ward. And until 1928, Packard occupied a leading position in the production of luxury cars in the United States. And they even supplied the Soviet Union with quite decent volumes. Okay, stop. In the sense of the Soviet Union, there's also like communism, equality. That's all like. No one has any money, everything is fine. Yes. It's just that packages for the people were purchased in state institutions. Then, as if the car was, in principle, well, such a phenomenon that, like, fuck, the box is going by itself. Like, and they didn't have the type of understanding that this is a luxury car, not sweets, just cars. Already miracles. The new model of the Zaporozhets. Everything is fine, don't worry. It's just that more than half of the state park at that time consisted of Packards. And so, of course, equality, communism, cookies, that's all. There is even a legend that some parts of the Packard were used in the design of the very first Soviet car, Z-110. But we'll look at this legend later somehow, because there's also a beating damn story there. But during the Great Depression, Packard got pretty bad, because he had only luxury cars and no more. Demand fell just into the baseboard, and if the big three had an option to offer some budget option there and so on, and they somehow left at the expense of these sales, Packard had nothing to offer people. Therefore, they decide to move into the segment of more budget cars, where they will lose the competition of the big three year after year over the next 20 years, simply because they have more experience and resources in this regard. Because they started to dilute the brand, they started to lose their original customer. If now Rolls-Royce creates some model based on Toyota Corolla, then this will be the last day for Rolls-Royce. This is obvious now, but it was not obvious to Packard in the 20s. In 1948, when all manufacturers are already chasing an unrealistically cool appearance, the package produces the 23rd model, which was popularly nicknamed the inverted in the bathroom. Well, like it was really a very strange car from a design point of view. Against the background of the others, it was all bullshit. And at this moment, when the company was teetering on the verge of profitability, sales of all this, it was pushed into the abyss by its own workers. Do you remember what I said about trade unions? Meet Walter Reuther. About this dude, oddly enough, there is practically no information in the Run-It, and it was a very big surprise for me that it is impossible to find something about this person in Russian, and now you will understand why. He was brought up in a family of German immigrants, and Bodek was, well, a bit of a twisted socialist, and constantly loaded his children with issues there like equality, women's rights, communism, and all that stuff. And at the age of 19, Walter, you decide, you have to get out of the house, as it were, and comes to get a job at the Ford plant. The joke is that at that moment, the minimum age for you to become a worker, for a head start, was 25 years old. But the shift master liked Walter so much that someone wrote in the documents that he was almost retired and hired him. Very quickly, Walter became the highest paid employee at the Ford plant, only because he was very skilled at reading technological maps and regulatory documents. As we can see, practically nothing has changed in 100 years, judging by Ford's modern products. If you can read, then you will already be guaranteed to be the best employee of the month. In 1927, when Walter has been working at the Ford plant for quite some time, an interesting thing happens. The production of the Ford Module T is coming to an end, and Ford, like a real production one who is not used to throwing anything away, sells the assembly line together with the workers, the Soviet Union. The workers were meant to simply, well, like, bring, assemble, and set up an assembly line. And yes, GAZ started with the Ford Module T assembly line. The first models that released GAZ were, in fact, Gaza and Gaza, like fucking batteries. And it was just a reshaped and very crookedly assembled Ford and Ford. And so, A bunch of workers led by Walter, because he was the only one who could read, were sent to establish production here in the Soviet Union, and that's where Walter fucked up, because minus 30, unheated barracks, workers live simply in unimaginable conditions. The management and everyone don't give a shit about everything as much as possible. No one manages anything, and no one assumes any responsibility, and no one knows how to manage anything. As you and I remember, about 15 years ago, before these events, all the people in the country who knew how to lead there, and at least understood something about the industries, they were all shot, dispossessed, that's all. Walter wrote letters to the media every day, to the committees, in order to somehow draw attention to the fact that employees live minus 30. There is nothing. They don't drown. Nobody gives a shit. Welcome to Russia. What did you want? And since Vitka, and I think he became Vitka very quickly, after he came to us in the Soviet Union, had full insurance from Ford, and a furious fire in his eyes, he went on a trip after fulfilling his obligations. He put a conveyor line there for 2 years, and after that, he decided to travel by bike. By bike. Like, the dude participated in the launch of the plant. Then everything turned out that way. He looked at what they had collected. He was like, oh guys, in the S, I went on a bike like. This is a sensible traveler. One more time, he goes by bicycle to Turkey, to Iran, to India, to China. Somehow, then he gets to Japan, where he is hired as a sailor on some kind of cargo ship that goes to the States and returns home, and discovers his own brother then that he is just arranging a trade union. And since Vitek has seen enough of the hungry horrors of the USSR in minus 30 and all that, plus, I also traveled around the countries and studied the experience of workers there. He was very excited about this idea, and at this moment, he decides to devote himself to the fight for the rights of people. Why I mock it so much, you will understand later. But here is his quote, "All people on earth crave simple things. Work with certain guarantees, huge opportunities for their children, and of course, freedom. We feel that we can contribute to the common cause and help American workers build strong and democratic unions. That's why we joined the trade union movement. I'm telling you about this pretzel because the result of his convulsive activity will be YUL, United Automobile Walkers. This is an American trade union organization that is still working, and it is called, among other things, one of the main reasons for the fall of Detroit. It all started, well, in principle, very adequately. The first strike, or rather the first action, happened at the Kelsey Hayes plant, which supplied the Ford plant and the Ford conveyor, with brake drums and wheels. Vitek and his brother convinced the workers to organize a strike, well, to stop production, everything, to stop working. In response to the demands of the management to speed up the conveyor, the workers seemed to be constantly losing fingers there in production, or even whole limbs, and in theory, along with an increase in the speed of the conveyor, it was possible to increase the rate of finger loss in the same way, such as workers, and therefore, it was necessary to strike urgently and slow down enterprises. In short, as a result, the workers agreed, stopped working. In fact, the conveyor got up, and ordinary, well, people who are just there, apparently families, friends and all that, who blocked the exits to the factory and do not let the management there, also joined them. And after 10 days of such a move, Kelsey's management had to meet the actual requirements of the workers, because after all, Uncle Ford needed drum wheels, like brake drums, because there was also a conveyor. Well, damn, well, dude, well, now the most important conveyor will become, it will hurt. And the result of all this strike was that in the end, the conveyor was slowed down, and the management had no right to dismiss the striking people, because they kind of joined Bio, and the plant agreed with Bio, and this was like a condition for ending the strike. And this is a completely stupid situation. You build a production, you build a factory, you hire people to work, and on the terms they agreed to, you pay them a salary. At some point Vitek comes, the whole thing gets up, you incur fucking losses. You force them to look for a Ford at an additional supplier, thereby reducing their profits for the future, slowing down the conveyor belt, and you can't fire these workers.
Замедляешь конвейер, и ты не можешь уволить этих рабочих.
If they drink, mess up, don't come to work, you can't fire them. Go and rub it with Vitka, and Videk will already decide whether someone can be fired or not. After this event, you begins to officially exist and immediately begins to beat the top. At that moment, in 1936, the biggest producer was Jam, and on December 31st, 1936, the biggest sit-in at the Jam factory in Flint begins. She is sedentary because, well, the workers literally sat on their ass right at the factory and sat right here in the premises. That's it, here's the 31st, they're all like Merry Christmas, we're kind of sitting. But the management did not break off and took off the heating in the factory for the night, like, well guys, sit down and freeze. But again, since communism is there, these ideas are communist, there are people there. The workers were all worried, everyone is on strike, there is an example of the USSR, there is Europe, that's all. It would be very easy to alarm the workers, and that's why the workers striking in Flint were supported by guys from other factories. A few days later, workers at the Detroit Flatwood plant, which produced engines for Cadillacs, sat down on their ass on the floor in the same way. Then there was a chain reaction. Oakland, California, Pontiac, Michigan, and St. Louis, Missouri. Workers all over the country supported the guys in Flint. As usually happens in such situations, the police came and tried to organize it all somehow. That guys, let's maybe disperse. That you're sitting here, they're waiting for you there at home, and so on. But no negotiations were successful. Then, at some point, batons, bullets, tralala went. 13 workers were eventually injured, but the plant was not given away. The mayor even had to intervene here with 2,000 guards just to ensure security. Not to come and shoot them to hell, but just so that no one would kill anyone, because the intensity of passions was, well, monstrous. New Year, it's cold down, without heating. The plant is standing, and there are roses sitting inside. So-so situation. But Jam gave up only after the workers of the factory, which was the only one producing engines for Chevrolet, sat on the ass. Chevrolet was the most budget-filling brand at that time, and it depended on it. The fate of the entire company depended on this brand. And when the workers were already sitting on the ass there, that's it, Jam gave up and had to agree to all the conditions and sign all the documents with you. The strike lasted 44 days. And Roy, brother Vitka, after everything was over, said, when the guys left the company, I had never seen such a night, and most likely I will never see it again. As if the whole country had gained independence, families reunited for the first time since the strike began. Children rushed into the arms of their fathers with tears of joy in their eyes. It was a sea of humanity in which the fears in the minds of the workers no longer existed. As a result of this strike, a completely fierce infernal document is signed with Jam. Brutov's Fred to Detroit. I don't know what kind of Dennis, it makes no sense to translate it, but the most important thing is that this document, think about it now, gives you the right and a place in the management of the concern, in exchange for a promise not to hold strikes for 5 years. Make sense of it. Vitek, together with his brother Roy, having organized large-scale strikes at all Jam factories, are squeezing out a full-fledged place in the board of the concern. Do you think they stopped there? No, of course not. For weeks later, 60,000 Chrysler employees were sitting on their ass, and he also joined the Jewel with the same conditions. The problem is that there is a strike with the conveyor assembly method. This is the worst thing that can happen. Take a look, all the parts, all the components on the entire assembly line. These are products of other industries that have their own conveyors in the same way. And if the main conveyor gets up for at least 1 day, and then months, absolutely the whole system is covered with a furry animal. Dealers don't get their cars, they have nothing to pay managers' salaries with, firstly. Secondly, customers come to the salon, there are no wheelbarrows, they go to competitors, and, accordingly, the entire brand reputation and demand for cars generally falls. From the other end, all suppliers immediately have sales, and they also need to either slow down their company and, accordingly, not pay salaries to people, dismiss them there and so on, or work in a warehouse, and for this they need working capital, and they also do not have it, because there is no sales. And such a stagnation, at least on one of the conveyor links, immediately immediately puts absolutely the entire system, and then restore the work of absolutely all companies. Just a titanic job. And just think for a second, if the UA had such a powerful tool for influencing business, would they use it for personal interests? No, well, what are you? Well, no, of course. It's all for the good of the workers, that's all. World peace is important to us. That's equality. Oh yeah, sorry, my Rolls-Royce pulled up over there. I'm off. The only one who cut off what was happening was Ford, because this pepper understood much more about sociology and politics than all other automakers. There was a very funny person in his board, Harry Herbert Bennett. Damn, the name as you know, like a real gangster is. And in fact he is. It's like Valuev, only smart. Here is an analog. He is a boxer there, a soldier of the Navy. And on the board, he was actually responsible for the safety of absolutely all factories, companies, tralala. In short, like your own personal chop. What fuck? Come here. Fuck. And the pussy is there. Fuck. That's the kind of guy who was on the board. There is a funny fact about this character. As befits a real turned warrior, he was paranoid. It always seemed to him that he was being watched, could be attacked and killed. And look at the house he built himself in Michigan, on Lost Lake. It was a real impregnable fortress. The whole house was surrounded by a moat, sharpened wooden stakes. The only road to the house led over a bridge, inside of which explosives were planted, well, just in case. There was a tower with a guard post on the roof, where armed guards were constantly on duty. In case of an attack, there was a secret staircase in the house, along which you could run out to an underground shelter, facing the lake, which you could cross by boat and hide. The stairs had different steps, so that people who could chase Bennett had every chance of breaking their legs in the dark. And Bennett himself was constantly training, running back and forth on this ladder to memorize the step of each step. And such an absolutely mentally healthy person was in charge of the security of the Ford plant. Remember the hunger march I mentioned at the beginning, where police and security guards shot at workers? Harry was in charge of this operation. This guy had the authority, which Ford personally gave him, to frighten, threaten, fire, and even beat up any employee who publicly or secretly expressed approval of the ideas of the trade unions there, the socialists. From this all, that's as soon as someone stuttered something that I was right, you immediately flew into the soup. At the same time, for a moment, Ford's workers were the most well-off, with insurance, with medicine, with all the bullshit. It's not worth it. I'm kidding here, of course, but nevertheless, the Ford workers were in very cool conditions as employees. After Chrysler fell in front of L, the only one left was Ford, and accordingly, he became the main target. But everything was so well organized at his factories that it was simply impossible to break through there as an agitator. Plus, all the employees, well anyway, valued their place because they understood that others had it worse. Others are really worse. They will pay less, they will mock more, and eating here will not help in any way. And as a result, Vitek came up with absolutely brilliant crap from the point of view of her, marketing and so on. He, along with a bunch of journalists, showed up, well, they're plus with his brother, they're with some other people, with the crowd. He showed up at the entrance to the Fort River Roch complex. This is the largest factory in the world at that time, which belonged to Ford. It was just a huge type of technical machine. And they, in fact, began handing out leaflets at the entrance. Unionism, but Otfordism. Fuck knows how to translate it, but I think you understand the meaning. Since in fact they are with their crowd, well no, nothing was violated, and no one touched them. Harry Bennett and his guys were calmly standing at the checkpoint. They're all there, leaflets, but nothing happened. And Vitek, seeing that there is no heat of passion happening, the guys are all standing quietly and not digging. There are journalists. Photos like we need to do something, we need a movement. He takes 3 Yo leaders with him and breaks through the checkpoint. Well, there was such a bridge, so he tried to climb up on the bridge in short. But this was already impossible to do. That's a no-no. Don't. And of course, the guards tried to stop him. But no matter how much the guys resisted, in short, a scuffle ensued. And so Vitek, under the flashes of cameras and video cameras, snatches from the hearthiest cunts from the guards. As you can see from this photo, his colleague Richard Frankenstein, yes, the dude has a very funny surname, got a lot more, but no one remembers about it. The press always talked only about Vitka, so nothing terrible happened, he just got his nose smashed. But by smearing bloody snot on a white shirt, Vitek again strengthens his image of a man who fights for the rights of workers to the last drop of blood and unite urgently. Otherwise Ford will do this to each of you. The press, happily turning the whole story into that of Ford. A tyrant rapes people and eats babies in basements at night. They carried this nonsense like a red banner in absolutely all publications. Ford, of course, tried by all possible methods, somehow logically or otherwise, to get rid of all the ads. But you can't trample on the words of Forbes, Life, Fortune magazine. For 4 years, the shit was boiling. For 4 years Ford was pelted with mud from all the windows. And since his company still suffered losses because of this, in the 41st year, Ford accepts Yo's terms in the same way. Yo mentally became a political tool. And well, my personal opinion is that just the same here are the rights of workers, this stuff. It was in the background. The most, in the board, half were communists in Yo. And it seems to me that the most important ideological bullshit. It was a confrontation between the idea of communism and capitalism. They say that you are all making money here. Move over. We also want to. For a second, the workers really worked for 30 hours a week, that is, not an 8-hour working day, but a 6-hour working day. And they received twice as much as the entire market. And it wasn't Yo's doing, it was up to them. But at the same time, Yo climbed into absolutely all the processes that she could and tried to somehow get something there. As an example, Vitek somehow came up with a very interesting program, which he called 30-40. This means that you need to leave a 30-hour working week to workers, but at the same time, pay a salary as for a 40-hour one. Like, at the expense of what? The SCA. Let's just increase the wage fund by 33%. And what did you do? So maybe we'll speed up production somehow or something. No. In no case can anything be accelerated. We will get it. No. We just want to work the same way as always. Just get more money. And thank God, she was not accepted. But damn, that's just how do you like it? Is the program normal or not? And by the way, remember that Yo's first contract promised not to strike for 5 years. Guess how Yo celebrated the 5th anniversary of this contract? That's right, in 113 days, with a strike at the gem factories. Well, let's close the production for 3 months, even for 4 months, almost just for you. You pay money at the same time, and even the 5th month, we will be missing. As you can guess, she was crushed by absolutely everyone. And if the big three could somehow stay afloat due to their large sales volume and other things, then the poor guy couldn't stand the pact. We have moved from Packard to this topic in general. Are you still with me? Is there anything else? Brother, we remembered about the package quickly. First, the Bentrix plant got up for a week-long strike, which supplied brakes for the Packer, and then the Bricks plant got up, which supplied body parts to the Pack. And then, in fact, the conveyor itself. Pack, yes, just sat on his ass exactly. And that's it. We sit, we strike, we do nothing. Against the background of competition and rather serious marketing mistakes, these strikes dealt devastating blows to the company. In the agony of death, just not to avoid bankruptcy, Packard conceives a deal with Studebaker. They decide to buy the Studebaker company, which already at the time of the transaction was a fairly large budget manufacturer. And, in theory, the combined Studebaker Pack company was supposed to become the 4th after the big three and compete with them. And in principle, it was a promising thing. But the problem is that Studebaker's management forged absolutely all the reports, hid the losses and debts of the company from the management of Packard, and instead of an opportunity for growth and some kind of perspective, Packard bought himself a huge gaping black hole in finances. And by the 56th year, this leads to the fact that the huge Packard factory is closed. The complex was instantly emptied, and we can say that it became a symbol of the approaching collapse, because it was located right in the center of the city. At the peak of production, 40,000 people worked on it, and after the Packard collapsed, this complex remained unclaimed. You just had a huge abandoned building in the middle of the city, which firstly attracted absolutely all illegal organizations. Let's say there are poor people, beggars and tralala and drug addicts. And there someone tried to periodically remove something in chunks, somehow optimize, but one way or another, Packard died immediately irrevocably. and this whole complex still stands abandoned, even with the same signs, symbols, and so on. And now everything that I described to you before, this whole big picture, is starting to collapse. In 1956, the first blow was the closure of the Packard factory. 1957th year, the global crisis of overproduction. Absolutely everyone got it. That is, the economy of the whole world is very much shaken, and everyone is sick. Production in 1 year collapses by more than 12% across the country on average. In Detroit, this figure was higher. To this crisis was also added the crisis of world trade, which greatly reduced the trade turnover between different countries. Any crisis, this is always a reduction of workers, and it was very noticeable in Detroit. It was from 1957 that the population of Detroit began to plummet because everyone was no longer being hired to work. On the contrary, workers are being laid off, the streets are slowly beginning to be crowded with poor unemployed people, and all production is beginning to be optimized, because no one wanted to repeat the fate of Packard. The third blow. Remember, I told you about the influx of black people into the city. Here in the 60s, they will just play their important role. By this time, in fact, every fifth resident of the city is black. And most of them are frankly poor people who have not found a place under the sun or who have been fired from any production. The 60th. This is still the time when black people were subjected to very serious discrimination. And in fact, this issue has always been very acute in the United States. In the 63rd year, Martin Luther King pushes his famous
to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
The movement for equality of the black population is gaining momentum more and more, and given the fact that in Detroit, the white population has always introduced such a lifestyle for show, there have always been expensive cars, holidays, and very such magnificent buildings and everything in a row. The atmosphere is starting to heat up a little. Add to this the constant strikes, the dispersal of these police strikes, and the situation at this moment becomes simply explosive. A match is enough to make everything just flare up. And this match was a harmless police raid into one of the illegal bars, which was called Blind Pigs. It wasn't my idea, it's a real name. At that time, there was a curfew in the city, and it was a completely standard occupation for the police. Like after curfew to wander around the area, you find some bar there's a drunk sitting there, you drag him into the car, take him away, make out, let him go a day later. Nothing like that, everyone is used to it. But then, there were 82 people in Blind Pigs who were celebrating the return of their friends from the Vietnam War. Yes, at that moment, the Vietnam War was still going on. The Cold War was going on. And if I had also told you about everything about it, then our timeline would have been just some kind of impossible. As a result, everyone was arrested, and the people did not like it very much. Instantly, a huge crowd of onlookers organized, who did not like all this action very much. They, in order to vent their discontent, went to smash absolutely everything that came to hand. The very next day, the next morning, the whole city was engulfed in disorder and chaos. People smashed storefronts, set cars on fire, robbed shops, and in total more than 10,000 people took part in the riots. This event went down in history as the Detroit riot, and this is the only moment in U.S. history when the government had to use the military to suppress the riot. In total, it took 8,000 soldiers, 4,500 paratroopers, and tanks. They came to the city on tanks just to calm people down. The total result is as follows: 43 dead, 407 injured, of which only 182 civilians. The rest is the police, firefighters, and the military who tried to extinguish the fires, who tried to somehow, calm people down. 412 houses were burned, and 2,500 shops were looted. And imagine, you are a white man, a representative of the middle class. Wake up on Sunday morning, pour yourself a cup of coffee, go to the window, open the curtain, and see how the rioters are burning your car, bringing things from a nearby store, and at that time they are being shot at from tanks. What would be your reaction to all this? Well, fuck it. This is exactly how the whole sane population acted. The outflow of solvent, and most importantly, educated population from the city has begun. Absolutely everything was knocked down. By the 70s, just 3 years after the riot, every second resident of the city was already black. The fourth blow. Competition tied hands of the Big Three leadership. By this point, everyone already understood that the industry needed to change. The market is falling, production and demand are falling, and the leadership of the Big Three had to make a decision. But the South boycotted absolutely any of them. If at least something related to the reorganization of production, or there is a reduction in wages or something else. All this was immediately boycotted. It's been a political tool for a long time with its deputies. There are like slogans and everything in a row. And the biggest problem is that they thought on serious things, that they know how to run a business. But no, there were talented people on the board of the Big Three, but their hands were tied because no decision could pass. And nobody cared that without automakers, without these companies, there would be no these workers, no jobs, no production, no Detroit at all. Nobody cared. Up to this point, here, well, it rolled before, so it will roll now, everything is fine. In addition, at this point in all 70 years of the existence of the American automotive industry, they did not know what competition with other countries was. They didn't know what competition with the ideologies of other cars was. All they could do was compete with each other by attaching another meter of iron there to the car, shove an even bigger engine, a larger volume, call it all prestige, which you couldn't even think about and dream about at all. Please buy everything that American automakers were able to at this moment. And remember what I said about hippies. By the 70s, all these young drug addicts were already the main core of society. They made up the middle class. They were the pillar on which, the entire American economy stood. And for 20 years, American manufacturers could not hear their values. They didn't hear that these people don't need these cars anymore. And in the summer of 1949, 20 years before the 70s, until the moment I'm telling you about now, the first Volkswagen Beetle crossed the Atlantic. About the history of the creation of this car, we had a previous video here. If you suddenly haven't seen it, be sure to check it out. And to say that the Volkswagen Beetle against the background of the 50s American cars was squalor, but that's nothing to say. Lada Granta against the background of the BMW 5 also looks so-so, and there is no point in comparing this special. It cost cheap, the power was 25 horsepower, and besides, in fact, the price, a small fuel consumption. It had no competitive advantages, and in the 50s, nobody really needed them. Let me remind you, if your car at that time consumed less than 20 liters per 100, then you were not an economical practical person, but a beggar dolben. Therefore, in the first year, it was sold. Any idea how much? Hitler's great car, which is the most popular car in the world, which changed the automotive industry. How many sales were there in the first year? 2. Not 2,000, 2. Just 2 Beetles were sold in the 49th year. Who is that heroic type of sales manager? Like, guess what? You have 2 opportunities a year to eat. You see money twice a year, and the way people carry them to the cash register is not for you. In addition, throughout the existence of the Big Three, they never thought about the fact that people might need small cars. Well, in principle, as a phenomenon of wives there's like moving around the city, there's something else. Well, that is, they couldn't think of anything at all. They thought they needed just huge ships and that's all. From just to these little cars was. The bug just had a problem, that no one wanted to buy Hitler's car, because there was still this gaping wound of the Second World War. It was in people's minds. No one wanted to just associate themselves with it. But after 5 years of absolutely brilliant marketing, Volkswagen manages to reverse this thought in people's minds. And sales begin to grow. In the 55th year, Volkswagen opens its assembly shop in the USA, and in the 59th year, sales already reach 120,000 cars a year. Interestingly, a 5-year-old Beetle on the secondary, and a 5-year-old Chevrolet of some hefty sedan cost the same. But the joke is that initially the Chevrolet sedan cost twice as much. I have always told you, and I will tell you, the prices on the secondary market are the most objective indicator of reliability, demand, and in general, well, like the steepness of the car. And even though everyone was buying new Chevrolet sedans, the secondary was putting everything in its place. Both the Beetle and the hefty bucket from Chevrolet cost the same. And even then, when the Beetle was still not needed by anyone, and Volkswagen still meant nothing as a brand, even then the Americans were depreciating much faster than the Germans. And they also depreciated because they were disposable. Here you are all lying now that now the cars are disposable. There you bought it, then threw it away. It was invented in the 50s in the USA, when there was a demand for a car. It is simply impossible. Not every year, every 2 years, it was necessary for a person to buy a new model. Therefore, they were disposable. Some were buggy, unreliable, spare parts cost a horse. And by this time, when sales of the Beetle had already become noticeable, by the 60s, the big three began to slowly strain, and their answer was this. Chevrolet Carver, the cheapest Chevrolet model at that time. Following the example of the Beetle, they made this car rear-engined, with an opposed engine 2 and 3, or there are 2 and 7. There were several variations, and as you can guess, hastily designed and assembled by lazy American workers, this played only into the hands of Volkswagen. The Beetle was objectively better. Well, it's just better, despite the fact that he was a few years older there. In addition, as soon as the crane came off the assembly line, it turned out that it was turning over. For some reason, as if the engineers did not think that this car would still be driven, and on the highways, this car turned over very easily. And even the addition of an additional stabilizer bar in the restyling did not solve this problem. The people could not be deceived, even by the propaganda of the time and Motor Trend magazine, which the Carvers called simply a genius of engineering. This is the most. There was awarded the Car of the Year. There's still a fig mountain of awards, but for 10 years of the existence of this car, the total sales volume was 200,000 copies. In the 60s, in the early 60s, the Beetle was already sold in volumes of 100,000 cars a year. Americans, Sasso, and by the end of the 60s, in the 69th year, 550,000 Volkswagen Beetles were sold. How I like to pronounce it Volkswagen Beauties. But, even though these were objectively large volumes, Volkswagen alone would not have turned the situation around. While Volkswagen was distracting the attention of the big three, very angry and very hungry Toyota, Mazda, Honda and Nissan suddenly began to sneak up on them from behind. In 1957, this squalor appears in the United States. Toyota Toypat Crown. This is the first Japanese car that came to the US market. The Japanese followed the path of copying American cars. That's how the Chinese started copying Japanese cars there in the 2000th years, and at one time, the Japanese copied the Americans. They did, in fact, just fakes for American cars, only much worse, much scarier, and much cheaper. And when Japanese cars first entered the US market, they could only cause bewilderment. Like, how can this be called a car? Like, what are you? So that you understand, well, just for example, TP Crown could not move along most American highways. Why? Because there are height differences there, and he just couldn't get into the slide. He had such a weak motor that just when climbing the hill, he did not pull and overheated. And besides, this particular Crown experience cost a third more than a Beetle, which normally, by the way, crawled everywhere. It was light, small, there was enough motor, and it did not overheat. He was a Volkswagen Land Cruiser in the 25th body. In the country of hippies too, the fuck did not rest against anyone at all, like a paramilitary car. In the country of peace and flowers, it was like, well, 50 pieces a year. The volume was not thousands of pieces. That's like how much? 4 pieces a month, 1 a week. The Japanese conquered the Americans, but everything changed in 1964. This year, a third-generation Toyota Corolla is coming out of Conway. And starting from this particular car, we can say that the Japanese have understood what European and American consumers need. She had an air conditioner in the base, and was gilgated with a Toyo Glade machine gun. And they brought in Battista Farina, an Italian designer, for a second, one of the founders of such an unknown agency, as Pininfarina, to develop the design. His calling card was the creation of the original Alfa Romeo Spider, this car. He came out 2 years later than the Crown. And I must say that the Japanese have always done some extraordinary and very original advertising for their cars. And in the case of the Crown, they arranged tests in which the car had to travel 100,000 kilometers at a speed of 140 kilometers per hour along the mentioned expressway. And she coped without a single breakdown. For the 64th year, it was just a break in the template when you have a cheap car with an automatic air conditioner that did not break down for 100,000 kilometers. It's like what? How is it in general? Any American of the 60s would have collapsed before even reaching this highway, as in fact, half of the modern ones. And it worked. Toyota began to sell. And then, they millimeter by millimeter began to squeeze the market. There was a Toyota 2000 GT, which for a moment was filmed in Agent 007, and that was it too. Nick, me probably. Well, I'm not going to reveal the secret to anyone right now, that this is also advertising. Guys, where are the movies when there's a car and it's all advertising? It's all paid for. Childhood is over. And then there's the first generation Toyota Corolla. And by the 69th year, Toyota's total sales amount to 100,000 copies per year. At the same time, nobody knows, and nobody fucking needs, a company named Honda suddenly wins first place in the Nürburgring in a 600-kilometer race with its C500 model. One more time, race for 600 kilometers, Nürburgring, Honda first. Before that, they are not known to anyone. And in the 66th year, the C800 car comes out, which wins Formula 2 11 years in a row. Not for the whole, but in a row. 11. A distinctive feature of Honda at that time was economy and environmental friendliness, which in principle remains relevant even now. But then it was not much needed by anyone. But nevertheless, at that time, Honda sold the smallest and most energy-efficient generators, plus it also produced a supercab, which is the most popular transport, well, a mode of transport in general in the world. This is such a small moat, James May did a separate documentary about it there once, and she was, in fact, a company that dealt purely with this. She didn't even seem to be going in the car. And in the 72nd year, they bring the first Civic to the States. And even fuck with it with the car, the most important thing, there is a motor with C5cc technology. And this is important, because as soon as this engine appeared on the market, Ford and Chrysler said that we want the same. They realized that everything, we will not create such a thing anymore, because in terms of its cost-effectiveness technologies and energy efficiency, it was simply unattainable for Americans. And they are like, well, we'll have to buy motors from the Japanese. And from that moment on, you can already sort of put a check mark that everyone, the Americans, signed up for the fact that they lost to the Japanese in engine building. Of course, they tried to create something competitive, but all attempts were very crooked. There's a Ford Pinto, a Ford Maverick, a Chevrolet Vega, and an AMC Gremlin. Gremlin, the car, Gremlin. We're going to respond to the Japanese now. We're going to create a Gremlin bomb. Go bold. What? They behaved unrealistically very strangely in the 70s, and all their answers, well, against the background of the Japanese and Volkswagen Beetle, were very strange. And in the 73rd year, the last huge nail is hammered into the lid of Detroit's coffin, the fuel crisis. On October 17th, all the Arab member countries of the PLOC, Egypt, Syria, etc., stopped supplying oil to the United States and a number of other countries. Oil soars in price, and supply disruptions begin. And one day, the cult collapses at 8, because gasoline prices soar, it is not always available at gas stations. Even at some moments, it was introduced that this gas station only works on Tuesdays. Like it's not mine, not my memesic, but this, fact. That is, you come and can fill up only once a week. American cars suddenly become fucking useless to anyone, and their cost of maintenance, just at least operation, flies into space. And against this background, the Japanese and Germans, who have worked for the previous 10 years to make the most economical and reliable car, are becoming unattainable. What do you think the guys from Yo did? Maybe they are the bigwigs of business, they understand, they care about the workers, and this is all so that they have jobs. Probably, they locked themselves in their offices to design a new car, to create such a thing that everything is right. Right now we will kill the Japanese and Germans in one movement. Or maybe, they started thinking about production efficiency, how to improve the conveyor, how to reduce the cost. Yes, of course. Instead of everyone getting together, agreeing, fucking thinking, and doing something good, they started sponsoring anti-Japanese movements. They started buying Japanese cars. Fuck, think about it, please. They started buying Japanese cars, putting them up on the days of the city, on parades, and began to give everyone a sledgehammer, and the opportunity to drive in a wheelbarrow. Not a joke. Crowds of people gathered around the unfortunate queen, or something like that. They were given a chance, and they went to beat the Japanese fucking car. Competition, like a brilliant engineering solution. Let's tear them up, boys. And that's all that Yo and the Big Three were capable of under the leadership of these unions. New technologies, a new marketing strategy. No, take a sledgehammer, let's fuck Toyota. The dismissed workers, of course, were told that the reason for their dismissal, it's not that their leadership is incompetent and idiots, but that the Japanese are to blame for everything. A global conspiracy. The Japanese came and destroyed our fucking economy. And they, as another very tactically smart decision, those who were still working at the factory were given bumper stickers on the car, on which it was written, Nissan, Toyota, Pearl Harbor. Like, in reference to that very type of battleship. And it is very symbolic that I found an example of this sticker on such a very rusty Ford. Well, it's very funny, and it's very dumb. And how these decisions were made at serious meetings in the manuals, I can't imagine. Well, how does it look that there is a round table and such stickers? We first released the Corolla, now we will stick stickers. Great, and it would be fine if only these idiots from the South sponsored these movements and incited ethnic strife. So they were also supported in the highest echelons of power. There is such a dude, Lee Iacocca, the chairman of Chrysler at that time, and at the Council of the House of Representatives. He once joked, discussing the Japanese issue, he was like, should we drop 2 more atomic bombs on Japan? Haha, fucking funny fucked up. For 450,000 human lives, and a perfect joke, just a great joke, dude. And naturally, against the background of all this propaganda, owning a Japanese car was quite dangerous. But it was much more dangerous if you owned a Japanese face. And as sad as it was, but the culmination of all this was the murder of Vincent Chen, such a man, in 1982. Vincent and his friends were celebrating a bachelor party before the wedding. The next day he had like a wedding. And unfortunately for him, Ronald Ebbins was in the bar with him. I didn't come up with a last name. Ronald Ebbins. With his stepson Michael, like there, it doesn't really matter. And this stepson was recently fired from Chrysler, and Ebbins was still in management. He was a master there, in short, of the brigade. And at some point, these 2 people who were drunk in death decided that Vincent was standing there. And that was the whole reason for the defeat of the American automotive industry, and the fact that the stepson was fired from work, and that they did not get less, that he was standing there. The main reason. And a fight ensued, as a result of which Vincent Chen died a few days later in the hospital. The irony is that Vincent Chen was Chinese. The reason for the death of a person is simply that the UO and the leadership propagandized that in fact it's not in us. It's not in us, but the Japanese. And if you had a Japanese car, it was perfectly normal at that time, if you went out to it in the morning, and it was with broken windows, for example there, with punctured tires, stolen, burned, smashed and so on. Not because you are a bad person and something is bad, and you bought the wrong car. And in 1981, when the total volume of sales of Japanese cars was already very decent, the American government was very tense about this and thought to do. And they introduced a legislative norm that the volume of imported cars into the country cannot exceed 1,680,000 copies. In this way, they thought to limit the volume of sales in order to clear the field for their own, for the big three. And remember that there's a kind of hackneyed phrase, everything that's good for General Motors is good for America. It was under this slogan that they actually cleared the market. But Honda said, lol kek chebarek, and opened a factory in the 83rd year. In Ohio, not far from Detroit. They just completely built their own. Well, okay, you can't import it. We'll collect it here. What's the difference? The only thing is that the Japanese had no UL. There, as it were, the workers worked on his terms of the Japanese. And they had everything pretty strict. Fair, but strict. This material already refers to another issue, but I will still throw in here that the Japanese had all the car companies lined up. According to the laws of the army, everything was very strict there. And now everything is really very strict there, straight ranks and so on. But we will talk about this in the video. We will talk about Japan. 2 years after the opening of the Honda plant in Ohio, the Toyota plant for the assembly of Kings opens, and 2 years later, factory for the collection of motors and Camry 4. Well, the motors were assembled for the Camry, and in fact, the Camry itself also began to assemble in the States. And in the 90s, well, when Detroit was already irretrievably lost, the Court became the best-selling car in the United States, and the total sales of Japanese cars exceeded more than 3 million copies. A completely unattainable figure for American automakers at that time. And the higher the sales of Japanese cars rose, the more hell Detroit was sliding into. Instead of the capital of prestige, the development of the automotive industry, it has become the capital of drug trafficking, murder and arson. Remember the movie RoboCop? Not this is a modern one, something that has recently been released, but the right one, with Willis in the title role, of the 87th year. Do you remember the atmosphere that was there? It was shot in Detroit, and it was filmed in Detroit. It's exactly these turn of the 87th 90s. Of course, a small future is being drawn there, there's like our current 20s there. But the whole picture and the real state of affairs, it's the way it really was. And look at the irony. Right now, in the 2019 year, even Kia Hyundai, which started with copying Toyota cars, have a larger sales volume than American companies. Here are the statistics from Bloomberg. The most handsome, well, Volkswagen 3 and 6, Renault Nissan Mitsubishi 3 and 4, 3, 2, Hyundai Kia 2 and 4. And look how much Jam 2 and 15 differ from the first place and from Toyota. How big is the gap? Then Ford, and their Fiat Chrysler already. And all these figures only indicate that the era of the American automotive industry is over. More precisely, the American empire of cars is over, because they still produce something, but not on the same scale as their competitors produce cars. There is still a debate about what is the reason for the fall of Detroit. The racial issue, the unions, the fuel crisis, the mismanagement of the city. There are many reasons, but I, as a motorist, and as a person who has been digging in archives, sources and various historical materials for 3 weeks, believe that Japanese and German subcompacts were still at the center of this storm. More precisely, not the cars themselves, they are the ability of American companies and American management to compete with them. After 20 years of fat and success, they lost absolutely their sense of the market and no longer had control of the situation. In the early 70s, can Americans return to the leaders in the automotive industry? They can. Can Detroit be reborn? Maybe. But in the 2013 year, Detroit accumulated so many debts that for the only time in the world, for the only time in human history, the city was declared bankrupt. And yes, this is a very sad situation, but this is the only way out that the Americans and the rulers of the city had, to somehow bring it back to life. In fact, only the center is alive in Detroit now, and offices are being built there now. They want to make it the center of design, art, music, and all modern trends. And Even though there is at least some life going on in the center, the rest of Detroit, all the sleeping areas, are a desert of abandoned houses where, God willing, one person lives for one block. Anyway, the Japanese won this war. Despite the fact that they lost the Second World War, despite the fact that they suffered huge human losses during nuclear bombing and military operations, they were still able to rebuild their automotive industry completely from scratch and defeat the Americans. And in the next historical video, we will figure out how it is possible to lose 4 million people captured and killed, to be left without money, without resources, in complete isolation, under sanctions, and as a result, in 13 years, to break into leadership in the global automotive industry. Thank you very much for watching this video to the end. We have never done such a complex material in terms of script and editing, so your reaction to it is very important to us. If you liked it, then be sure to share it on social networks, send it to friends, chat, WhatsApp, and so on along the list. Thank you very much again, and see you next. Bye.